pajamas were already in my hand before I understood what they wanted from me. My brother-in-law slid the documents across our dead father's dining table and said, "Just sign where the tabs are and we can all move on with our lives." When I set the pen down without signing, my older sister stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor, and she slapped me across the face hard enough that my coffee mug rattled. "You don't get a vote here," she hissed. "You will sign it." That was the moment the estate attorney closed his folder, looked at my sister, and asked in the quietest voice I've ever heard, "Do you have any idea who you're talking to right now?" And the whole room went so silent I could hear the refrigerator humming in the next room. My name is Quinn. I'm 29, and I've spent my whole life being the one my family forgot to set a place for. I audit insurance fraud for a living, the kind where someone burns down their own warehouse and files a claim, and it's my job to find the gasoline in the accounting. I know how to read a lie when it's written down in numbers. I never once imagined the biggest fraud I'd ever uncover would be sitting at my own father's funeral reception, wearing black and dabbing at dry eyes. Before I tell you how that quiet question detonated the entire afternoon, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever had family treat you like an inconvenience until the second they needed something, hit subscribe. This one's for you. My father died on a Tuesday in March in a hospital outside Columbus, Ohio, with only me in the room. My sister Tessa had said she'd come, but she'd texted that morning that traffic was bad and she'd catch the next visiting hours. There were no next visiting hours. There were no next visiting hours. He squeezed my hand once, told me I'd always been the steady one, and then he was gone. I sat with him for 40 minutes before a nurse gently told me I could let go. Tessa cried beautifully at the funeral 4 days later. She wore a coat I knew cost more than my monthly rent, and she let her husband Brad steer her by the elbow like she might collapse from grief at any moment. They'd driven up from Cincinnati in a leased Audi that, I would later confirm, they were 3 payments behind on. People came up to her, not me, to offer condolences, because Tessa had always been the one who knew how to be seen. I stood by the guest book in a department store dress and signed people in. It was at the reception, back at Dad's house, that the documents appeared. The house wasn't a mansion. Let me be clear about that, because I think people picture these stories happening in marble foyers. It was a 4-bedroom colonial on a half-acre lot in a good school district, the kind of house a man who managed a regional auto parts distribution chain could pay off over 30 years if he never took a vacation, which my father mostly didn't. But the lot backed onto a parcel the county had just rezoned commercial, and a developer had been sniffing around the whole street for 2 years. The house and land together were worth around $1.4 million. To my sister, that number was the only part of our father that had ever interested her. Brad waited until most of the guests had thinned out. He has this way of smiling that doesn't reach anything above his mouth. He pulled a manila folder from a leather portfolio and laid it on the table where, an hour earlier, somebody's aunt had set down a tray of deli sandwiches. "Quinn, sweetheart," he said, and I hated the word in his mouth. "We've been talking, and the simplest thing, the kindest thing for everybody is for the property to go into Tessa's name. She's got the kids, she's got the stability. You're single, you move around for work. It doesn't make sense for you to be tied to a house in Ohio." I picked up the top page, old habit. My eyes went where they always go, past the friendly cover language, down to the operative clause. It was a quitclaim deed. It would have transferred my entire interest in the estate to a trust I'd never heard of, controlled solely by Tessa, with Brad named as successor trustee. There was a notary seal already partially filled out waiting. They'd brought a notary, they'd planned this for the day we buried him. "Dad didn't leave a will splitting this," I said carefully. "He left everything to both of us, 50-50. I saw it. The lawyer has it. Wills can be contested," Brad said pleasantly. "Trusts are cleaner. Think of the legal fees you'd save." That was when I noticed the man in the grey suit who'd come in with the small group from the funeral home and never left. He was sitting in the corner armchair with a leather folder of his own on his knees, watching all of us the way I watch a claims file I already know is fraudulent. "Just sign where the tabs are," Brad said, sliding the folder toward me, "and we can all move on with our lives." I set the pen down. I didn't slam it. I didn't throw it. I just put it on the table, lined it up neat with the edge of the folder, and said, "No, I'd like to read this with my own attorney first." Tessa stood up so fast her chair barked against the hardwood. She crossed the room in 3 steps and she slapped me. Open hand, full swing, across the left side of my face. My ear rang. My mug rattled in its saucer. A water glass somebody had left on the sideboard seemed very loud, suddenly in the quiet. "You don't get a vote here," she said, leaning down into my face. Her breath was sharp with the wine she'd been drinking since noon. "You always do this. You make everything difficult and slow and impossible, and then you act like the victim. Dad is barely cold, and you're going to fight me over paperwork? You will sign it. I want to tell you I had some perfect cinematic comeback. I didn't. My face was hot, my eyes were stinging, and for one ugly second I was 9 years old again. The kid who got blamed when Tessa broke the lamp. I just sat there with my hand pressed to my cheek. And then the man in the grey suit closed his leather folder. The sound it made was very small, but everybody heard it. He stood up, unhurried, and he looked at my sister, and he said, "Do you have any idea who you're talking to right now?" The room went silent. Tessa straightened up, confused. "Excuse me, this is a family matter. I don't know who you, and my name is Walter Pruty," he said. "I'm the executor of your father's estate. He retained me 8 months ago." He looked at me, and something in his face softened. "And I'm also a witness to the assault that just occurred at this table. There are 6 other people in this room who saw it." He let that sit. "Mr. Calloway," he said, turning to Brad, whose smile had finally fallen off his face, "I'd encourage you to put your folder away. Nothing in it is enforceable, and continuing to present it now under these circumstances would be a very poor decision for the both of you." I've replayed the next 10 seconds 1,000 times. Tessa's mouth opening and closing, Brad reaching to gather his papers and then freezing like even that might incriminate him. The cousins by the door pretending to study the family photos on the wall, and me, with my hand still on my burning cheek, slowly understanding that for the first time in my entire life, the room was not on my sister's side. Walter asked me, quietly, if I was all right and whether I wanted to step outside. I said I'd stay. What happened over the following weeks is the part I really wanted to hear, because the slap wasn't the story. The slap was just the moment the mask came off. The story is what was underneath it. Here is what was underneath it. Here is what I had not told my family. About a year before Dad died, when his memory had started slipping, he'd asked me to help him get his affairs in order. I'd assumed he meant a will. What he actually meant was that he'd noticed money leaving his accounts that he couldn't explain, and he was scared, and he was too proud to tell anyone but me. So I did what I do for a living. I pulled 3 years of statements, I built a spreadsheet, and I found it. Over 26 months, just under $290,000 had moved out of my father's accounts in increments small enough to look like the ordinary spending of a forgetful old man. $1,100 here, $2,000 there, a $4,000 home repair to a contractor that didn't exist. Every transfer that I could trace landed, eventually, in an account belonging to a home staging LLC. The LLC had 1 registered member. My brother-in-law, Brad Calloway. He'd been given power of attorney for medical and financial matters 2 years earlier, back when Tessa convinced Dad that she lived closer and could handle things. I'd been overseas on a job at the time and hadn't fought it. That signature was the gasoline. From the moment Brad held that power of attorney, he'd been treating my father's retirement like a personal line of credit, and he'd been careful and slow and patient about it, the way smart fraud always is. I had brought all of it to Walter Prue 2 months before the funeral, after Dad and I had quietly met with him to draft an honest will and to flag the missing money. Walter had advised us not to confront the family yet. Let the documentation do the work, he'd said. People who steal in small amounts always assume no one is keeping the receipts. Keep the receipts. So we did. Dad and I kept the receipts. What I learned at that funeral reception was that Brad and Tessa had no idea any of this existed. They thought they were dealing with grief-stricken, scatterbrained Quinn who'd sign anything to avoid a fight. They had no concept that the quiet sister who audited fraud for a living had spent the last year auditing them. The deed they wanted me to sign wasn't really about the house. I figured that out about a week later, sitting in Walter's office with the real picture spread across his conference table. The house was the bait. The trust they wanted me to sign into existence had a clause, buried naturally on page 11, that released the successor trustee from any obligation to account for prior management of the grantor's finances. In plain English, if I'd signed, I would have legally dissolved Brad of every dime he'd taken. The slap wasn't just panic. It was the sound of two people who had 3 payments left on a leased Audi, a second mortgage they hadn't told anyone about, and a paper trail closing in, all trying to make the witness sign away the evidence before she read page 11. I didn't press charges for the slap. I know a lot of people watching will be furious about that, and I understand. Believe me, my cheek understood, but I'd spent enough years inside fraud cases to know that the assault charge was the small fish. If I'd filed it, Tessa would have lawyered up, made it about a family altercation, painted me as the cold sister who'd sent her own sibling to jail over a misdemeanor. It would have muddied everything. So I made a different choice. I documented it. Walter took written statements from all 6 witnesses that same evening, while it was fresh, and we set them aside. Insurance, you could say. Then I did the thing I'm actually good at. I went to the people who care about numbers more than they care about feelings. I reported the embezzlement to Adult Protective Services, and because the LLC had crossed state lines moving money between Ohio and Kentucky to the appropriate federal channels for elder financial exploitation, I provided the spreadsheet, the bank records, the fabricated invoices, and the registration document showing Brad as the sole member of the staging company. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't text my sister a single accusatory word. I just kept the receipts and handed them to people whose entire job is to follow money. For about 6 weeks, nothing visible happened, and Tessa took my silence as surrender. She actually called me, the first call in 2 years that wasn't about logistics, to say almost warmly that she hoped we could put the ugliness behind us, and that she'd had the deed redrawn to be more fair. She offered me 10%. 10% of my own father's estate, framed as her generosity. I told her I'd think about it. I wanted her comfortable. Comfortable people don't move money out of accounts they think are safe. The reckoning, when it came, didn't arrive with sirens. That's the part the movies get wrong. It arrived as a certified letter, and then a forensic accountant from the state, and then a very different attorney sitting across from Brad, one he had to pay for himself. The home staging LLC's accounts were frozen pending investigation. The power of attorney was revoked retroactively, and the will my father had actually signed, the real one, witnessed and notarized and sitting in Walter's safe the entire time, split the estate evenly. With one specific instruction my father had added himself, that any sums found to have been improperly taken from his accounts during his lifetime were to be deducted from the share of whoever had taken them. My father, it turned out, had kept his own receipts too. When the dust settled, after restitution and legal fees and the deduction, Tess's half had shrunk to a number that did not cover the second mortgage. The developer still bought the lot. I sold my share, gave a chunk of it to the hospice that had cared for Dad in his last week, and kept the rest. I did not buy a leased Audi. The last time I saw my sister was in a mediation room with both our attorneys present. She looked older. Brad wasn't with her. I'd heard they were separating, which I suspect had less to do with morals than with liability. At the end, when the papers were signed, she looked at me across the table and asked, with what might have been the only honest emotion I ever saw from her, "When did you get like this?" I thought about Dad squeezing my hand, the steady one. "I didn't get like this," I told her. "I was always like this, you just never needed to look." I gathered my copies, lined them up neat against the edge of the folder, and I left. People ask me if I feel guilty. I don't, and I've made peace with not feeling it. I didn't ruin my sister's life. She and Brad ruined it themselves, one small fraudulent transfer at a time, while a man they thought was a forgetful old fool wrote down every date. All I did was refuse to set my name to a lie, and then keep the receipts. If there's one thing I learned through all of it, it's this. The people who count on you to keep the peace are very often the ones who've been quietly counting on you not to count. Don't sign on the dotted line because the room wants you to. Read page 11. Keep your receipts, and the next time someone slaps you and tells you that you don't get a vote, remember that the quietest person at the table is sometimes the only one who's been paying attention all along. That's my story. I'd love to know what you would have done in that room. Tell me in the comments and I'll be reading every single one. The thing I keep coming back to isn't the slap, it's the spreadsheet. For 26 months, Brad moved my father's money out in amounts small enough to disappear, and the whole time he was betting that nobody at our table was the kind of person who writes things down. That bet was the real story of my family. Tessa shoved a pen at me because she'd spent her whole life learning that I'd fall to keep the peace, and she was almost right. The version of me that signed would have absolved both of them with my own hand on page 11. What stopped me wasn't anger. Anger would have made me press charges for the slap and walk into a misdemeanor fight Tessa knew how to win. What stopped me was the part of me that refuses to put my name to something I haven't read. I think that's the quiet thing people miss about doing right. It's rarely loud, and it almost never feels heroic in the moment. Sometimes it just looks like setting a pen down and saying you'll read it with your own attorney first, while your cheek is still burning and your hands want to shake. I didn't beat Tessa and Brad because I was smarter than them in some flashy way. I beat them because months earlier, a scared old man asked his steady daughter for help, and instead of telling him he was imagining things, I pulled the statements and built the spreadsheet and believed what the numbers told me. That's a kind of patience most people don't bother with. The world rewards the person who can sit with a problem long after it stops being interesting, who keeps the receipts when there's no audience and no payoff in sight. And it took a strange kind of steadiness to do nothing, while Tessa offered me 10% and called it generosity. Every instinct I had wanted to tell her exactly what I knew. Staying quiet, letting comfortable people keep being comfortable while Walter's letters worked their way through the system, that was harder than any shouting match. Real strength, I've come to think, looks less like the moment you fight back and more like the months you refuse to flinch. If you take anything from what happened in my father's house, let it be this. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room or the one who throws the first punch. You have to be honest enough to refuse the easy lie, careful enough to understand what's actually being asked of you, and steady enough to wait out the people counting on you to break first. Read page 11. Keep your receipts. And when someone tells you that you don't get a vote, remember that the quietest person at the table is sometimes the only one who's been paying attention the entire time.